Bison yavoy yodoy asher atem mevakshim Mashiach 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 sheyavoy Bison yavoy yodoy Mashiach 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 sheyavoy.
So today we continue in our shiurim on Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. And the topic we will be discussing today is two different concepts, and both are part of the general mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel and the love of Eretz Yisroel. Yishuv Eretz Yisroel and Yeshiva Be'eretz Yisroel. One part of the mitzvah is to live in Eretz Yisroel. Live here, learn here, raise your children here. Yeshivas Eretz Yisroel. The other is Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. To build the land, to develop the land, to make it hospitable, to make it Ra'ui Liyeshiva. And the very first shiur we said in this Marechet of Shiurim on Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, I brought two different sources quoted by the Rishonim. The Ramban and those that follows in his footsteps, those that maintain that Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is a mitzvahs asay. As you probably could recall, we spoke at length in Shittas Rambam. The Rambam does not count Yishuv Eretz Yisroel as one of the Taryag mitzvahs, and we discussed the question, according to the Rambam, is it a mitzvah or is it not? So we spoke about that in the first year. I won't go over it again. But those that do count Yishuv Eretz Yisroel as a mitzvah sasei in the Taryag mitzvahs bring two different sources. One in Parshas Masai in Chumash Bamidbar, V'herashtem es ha'oretz v'yeshavtem ba. And the other is the beginning of Parshas Re'eh, V'yerishtem oisa v'yeshavtem ba. I just want to point out that in both these sources, the Torah uses a double language. V'yerishtem oisa v'yeshavtem ba. V'hoirashtem es ha'oretz v'yeshavtem ba. And l'cha'oire, this proves that the mitzvah is twofold. First of all, kibush Eretz Yisroel, to conquer the land, to develop the land, to making it fitting for people to come, for the thousands and millions to come and dwell in Eretz Yisroel. And the Ramban, mitzvah daled sheshochach harav, and the Ramban has two different sources, Ramban al Torah, as I quoted in the very first shiur, and the Ramban in the mitzvahs that he adds on that the Rambam omitted without justification according to the shita of the Ramban. The Ramban in mitzvahs to say Daled wonders why the Rambam doesn't count the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. And the Rambam also uses a very clear language that Shaloi ne'azvena b'yad zu loseinu o lishomema, that the mitzvah is not to leave Eretz Yisroel in the possession of other peoples, of other countries, of other umas u'olam, o lishomema, and not leave the land barren. So one could argue that the Kohen of the Ramban is don't leave it barren, come to live here. But I think that Ramban also clearly indicates that part of this mitzvah is don't leave the land in the hands of other nations, of other peoples, we should conquer the land, we should develop the land and not leave it barren. So there's a double mitzvah. Living in Eretz Yisrael, which is Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael, and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So in Gittin of Chesed Beis we learn that Chazal were lenient, and they were mater amira lenachri, and obviously even by Anissa Diuraisa, Koisven olav oinoi afilu b'Shabbos, you could sign an agreement of transaction buying a house from a non-Jew on Shabbos. And there's a huge machloikes Rishonim. The Bala Itur proves from this Gemara that amira lenachri is mutar for any mitzvah. But Toisvis, over there, on the spot, in Gittin Avches says, no, only for Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And in the very first shiur, I brought this sugya to prove that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah diuraisa. It is totally unreasonable that for all the mitzvahs diuraisa Chazal were not matir amir anochri, for a mitzvah derabanan they were. Because a mitzvah derabanan by its very nature is of less importance and chumrah than a mitzvah diuraisa. So this Gemara seems to prove that it's a mitzvah diuraisa, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. But what are we dealing with? Signing a document, a contract to buy a house from a non-Jew. Chazal were matir ksivas amalocha diuraisa, amir enochri b'amalocha diuraisa, to buy the house. Not necessarily that the person wants to come to live in the house. And maybe he's already living in Eretz Yisrael, in a rented place, and he wants to buy the house. So they were mater amir enochri b'amalocha diuraisa, to purchase a house, to transfer that house from the possession of a non-Jew to the possession of a Jew. That is not necessarily Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael, but rather Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. To conquer the land, to take possession of the land, to build the land, to develop, and make it appealing to the millions that ultimately we expect in Kibbutz Goliath. They should all come together be'eretz kodshenu. So this Gemara seems to prove that mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not only dwelling in the land, living in the land, but also developing the land and building the land. Another source would be Bava Kama Ayin Tesumet Beis, and there are various takonos of Yeshua ben Nun, and the Gemara says Ein Megadlen Behei Medaka. And why is that? Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, because the Hemedaka destroyed the agriculture, and Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, that is the Gemara, Ein Megadlan Behemedaka Eretz Yisrael. So once again, this is to make the land appealing to Jews in the entire world, and to develop the land and to make it suitable. So these two Gemaras seem to prove that mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not only about living in Eretz Yisrael, but also developing Eretz Yisrael and making Eretz Yisrael available and appealing l'klal Yisrael in the entire world. So Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is one concept, Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael is a different concept, and I think both are included in the mitzvah, and especially according to what we were medayik. Lishne dikra, v'yirashtem es ha'oretz, v'yeshavtem bo, v'yirishtem oisa, v'yeshavtem bo. So many wonderful Jews throughout the ages, even those that didn't come to live in Eretz Yisrael, but invested huge monies in Eretz Yisrael to buy land, to build settlements, to develop the agricultural infrastructure, and that is definitely a gewaldige mitzvah, and it is included in the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Investing in Eretz Yisrael, that is part of the mitzvah, because in the modern world, Eretz Yisrael needs investments. It needs to build infrastructure. It needs to build infrastructure of finance, of industry, and pshita infrastructure, direct infrastructure, systems, transportation, communications, and developing the land and making it appealing and suitable. Kol Yoshveya is part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Many Gedolei Yisrael, while they were living in Chitzros, bought houses in Eretz Yisrael. Some of them never were zeicha to come to live here. Some of the greatest Gedolim of Europe in their later years came to live in Eretz Yisrael. And they left behind in Chutz La'aretz status, Choshev Rabbonim, and they left everything behind just to come L'choinen Esaforo Shel Eretz Yisrael. And many others were never Zoicha. Among those that came at a relatively old age were Rabbi Tzile Peterburger, left Europe and came to live in Yerushalayim B'Sof Yomov. Rameh Oyabach, the Imre Bine, the Torres Chesed, Reb Shneur Zalman from Leadi. These were the greatest Gedolim in their Kehulos and Chutz La'aretz. And some of them were recognized in Eretz Yisrael to be the greatest Gedolim, but not all of them. So many Gedolim dreamed and yearned to arrive in Eretz Yisrael. Some had the Schia, others didn't. But many of them, stage number one, invested in Eretz Yisrael. And some Gedolim were deeply involved in building settlements. The Nefesh Chayo, Reb Chaim Lozavaks, the Rav of Kalish in Poland, was one of the greatest Gedolim in Poland. And he spent a great deal of his time to plant Pardesim of Esroigim in Eretz Yisrael. One of the first Pardesim for Esroigim was planted and developed by the Nefesh Chayo up north in Kfar Chitim. And in his letters he describes he came once and again and spent months in Eretz Yisrael just to supervise that Pardes, and he didn't do it for business. He didn't do it for business. Probably invested far more than he could ever gain. He did it for the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And he writes in his letters to give parnosa for Yidden. Today, it's all Arabs working the fields. Jews no longer like to work. But in those days, it was giving parnosa for the Aniyei Eretz Yisrael, and that was his objective. Not only Chibas Esragi Eretz Yisrael, because in Chutz La'aretz, everybody wanted in Eretz Yisrael the Kesek, especially in Poland, not so much in Hungary. So his motive, his objective was to develop the land, to give parnosa la'aniyei Eretz Yisrael, and to supply Esragi Eretz Yisrael, but that is just a moshel of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, not Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael. He dreamed about living in Eretz Yisrael. So let me share with you some amusing thought. The Nefesh Chayo writes that he hopes ultimately to move in Eretz Yisrael. And when he does, he writes, his plan is he wants to learn a half a day, and a half a day he wants to work the fields of Eretz Yisrael. And that is amazing. One of the greatest Gedolim of his time. And he wrote an amazing Sefer, Shalos HaTshuvas Nefesh Chayo, Gevaldige Tshuvas. He was the son-in-law of Reb Shiur Kitner. And he corresponds with all the Gedolim of his time. There's a Tshuva in Hilchas Mekvois, in Nefesh Chayo, and he writes that the Divrei Chaim and the Chidush Sharim, the two greatest Rabbeim of that generation, turned to him. He should be Mavarer Halacha and write a Tshuva. And he planned to spend a half a day working the fields. And whenever I mention this, I say, maybe that is why it was not Min HaShamayim to come live in Eretz Yisrael. Kodesh Baruch Hu didn't want one of the greatest Gedolim to work the fields a half a day. And maybe because that was his plan, it was Min HaShamayim that he never made it. So I'm just saying this with a touch of humor. But it is an example of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, contrary to Yeshiva Be'eretz Yisrael. So this is a very fundamental concept. So it is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. But even if it can't live in Eretz Yisrael, it is a mitzvah to invest in Eretz Yisrael, to build Eretz Yisrael, to develop Eretz Yisrael, and especially in those days, going back 100 and 150 and 200 years ago, when the land was barren, and it was occupied almost totally by an Arab population. Many wonderful Jews, Beineim Gedoli Yisrael, bought houses, bought land, built, developed, planted orchards, planted fields, invested in agriculture just to build the land and make it appealing, make it inviting, and make it suitable to absorb Bnei Achenu Bnei Yisrael, Yoshvei Medina Zayam. One additional point that I want to make part of mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is also lekayem mitzvah voiseh. We will dedicate a separate shiur about when a person comes to live in Eretz Yisrael, he needs to be diligent about his performance of mitzvahs, and he is required to more zehirus and more zirizus and more dveikus and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to be a better Jew. This is a comment that the Chayodam makes, and we will discuss it. It's probably going to be the last shiur in our series, Mitzvah Leis Kadosh B'Eretz Yisrael. And we also find it in Igeres HaGra. There's a very famous letter that the Gra wrote his family, and he's writing to his wife, to his mother, to his children, addressing each of them separately. And in that passage, when he turns to his mother, there's a very short line, but everything from the Gra is very short, as you know. And he writes, if we will have, and he wrote this letter when he planned to move to Eretz Yisrael, to travel to Eretz Yisrael. At the end, he didn't make it, as we know from the Gra's story, from his biography. But when he planned to leave Vilna and to go to Eretz Yisrael, he wrote this letter. And it is a monumental letter. And in one sentence, you write, if we will have the schiyah to move to Eretz Yisrael, sham tzorich zehirus, I don't remember the exact wording, but he does write, in Eretz Yisrael, you need to be more dedicated and more devoted to avodas Hashem, and more diligent in the performance of mitzvahs. But lecha'ayre, mitzvahs atluyas boretz is part of mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. This is the promised land. But what makes the land unique is not only the abstract kedusha, but the opportunity to be makayim mitzvahs atluyas boretz. In Soite Daf Yud Daled, the Gemara says, why did Moshe yearn to come to Eretz Yisrael? And we know from Chazal, V'eschanen al Hashem, V'eschanen is gematria, the numerical value of 515, and Chazal say, Moshe Rabbeinu davened 515 tefillas with one bekosher. He wanted to come into the Holy Land, and it was not to be. We discussed this at other opportunities. But the Gemara says, V'chilechol meperoiseo hoyu roitze. Why did Moshe yearn to come to Eretz Yisrael? Because he loved the fruits. Loinas ava Moshe erolakayim mitzvahs atluyas ba'oretz. The reason Moshe Rabbeinu so much want to come to the Eretz Yisrael is lekayim mitzvahs atluyas ba'oretz. And in Minchas Osha ala Torah, I wrote, and why doesn't the Gemara say I wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael to be mekayim the mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? Isn't that enough? According to the man, we're dealing with the mitzvah d'oraisa. Even according to the Rambam, in my opinion, as I explained in Shiur number 1, we're dealing with the mitzvah d'oraisa. So what is the question? Why did Moshe so much want to come into the land? And the Gemara says, Lo nesava Moshe el lakayim mitzvahs atluyas boretz. So why doesn't the Gemara simply say, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? So in my sefer, I suggested maybe this is a raya that one is Makayim Mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael be'ever Yarden, and the other side of the Jordan, and the other side of Yarden. But fundamentally, I think l'cha'ayra, what we prove from this Gemara is Mitzvahs Atluyas Boretz is part of Mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And the Mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, maybe not exclusively, maybe not only, but part of Mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is to be Mekayim the mitzvahs that are unique to Eretz Yisrael, mitzvahs atluyas boretz. So many of us today, living in Eretz Yisrael, we are Mekayim the mitzvahs atluyas boretz in a passive way, but not in an active way. You buy stuff with a hechsher. Comes Shnas HaShvius, we don't have land. We're not farmers. Oh, there are many farmers in Eretz Yisrael, Shomer Shvius. But the vast majority of Bnei Torah from Jews own no land. So they're not Makayim the mitzvah of Shvisas Ha'oretz in an active way. Even Kiddush Shvius is becoming less and less relevant, especially to those that eat Peres Nochrim without Kiddush Shvius. Today is an age everybody wants to have an easy life and make life comfortable and easy. So why get into problems of Hefsid, Shvius, and Schoira? We buy Peres Nochrim. Trumas Amaisis. We don't have fruit trees. So you buy in the supermarket. You buy with the Hechsher. Many B'nai Torah mafresh Trumas Amaisis, but just lachumr. And that is why I am so happy I have a lemon tree in my backyard. On one hand, it's a nuisance. If I wouldn't have a lemon tree there, I would probably build another 2 rooms in my house. I don't want to uproot that tree. It gives beautiful lemons, and many of my friends, some of you, many of those that are listening to this Shiur, know my house. You visited my house, and you know the lemon tree in the backyard. So it means so much to me because I have tevel vadai, and from time to time, I could be mafresh to Trumas with a brocha, because it's tevel vadai, and a mafresh truma gedola, and maser rishon, and trumas maisa, and maser sheni, or maser oni. And when I'm mafresh maser sheni, I have an additional mitzvah, an additional brocha of chilul maser sheni. So at least they have the privilege and the pleasure in an active fashion to be Makayim mitzvahs at Yisroel. And that is the reason Moshe Rabbeinu nisava Lekonas Eretz Yisroel lo yelechol meperosei hoyatzorech Lakayim es mitzvahs at Yisroel. And that is part of the essence of mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. So today we spoke about the concept of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel and Yeshivas Eretz Yisroel on 2 sides of the same coin, and both are included in the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. V'hoirashtem es ha'oretz v'yeshavtem ba v'yerishtem oiso v'yeshavtem ba. Yerotzen shechalkenu imoim.
Mashiach, 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 Mashiach,